Welcome to Super Context, a podcast autopsy of media.
How we consume it and how it informs our everyday culture.
I'm Christian Sager, a writer and a designer.
And I'm Charlie Bennett, a librarian and a radio raconteur.
Each episode is us trying to understand the entertainment world that we all live in.
Just a little bit better.
Today's episode is about Spinning by Tillie Walden. This 2017 graphic novel is a memoir about growing up, figure skating, and coming out of the closet. We talk about how Walden approached the project with guidance from her editor, while looking at the comics industry as a whole and the tensions between the book market and the direct market.
You can find show notes at patreon.com/supercontext, where you can leave a comment on the website, or you can email us at supercontextpodcast@gmail.com. Where do you buy your comic books?
Yeah, that's a good question. Charlie, I want to start today's episode in a way that's different from how we've usually done it. I want to start with a quote from the book itself, and this is actually pretty much the last thing other than the acknowledgments that's written in the book. This is by Tillie Walden in her book Spinning. People ask me all the time, what's the book really about? I still say ice skating, mostly because it's the simplest answer. But it really feels like such a huge question, what is this book about? I'm the type of creator who is happy making a book without all the answers. I don't need to understand my past fully in order to draw a comic book about it. And now that this is a book that other people will read, I feel like it's not really my turn to answer that question. It's for the reader to decide, to speculate, to guess. It reminds me of how in English class in high school, we would always talk about the author's intentions in every moment. And I always used to wonder if there was ever an author who really didn't mean any of it, and the meaning found its way in by accident. I think I'm that author.
Okay.
So that's the last paragraph of Tillie Walden's author's note in Spinning, and I want us to keep that in mind as we go through this episode. So what she's specifically saying at the end of the book here is that she doesn't really know what the book is about, and that she feels like she is an author who doesn't know what the meaning is, but she wants the reader to figure it out for themselves, and she's okay with that.
She did not intend a meaning beyond what she was actually telling us.
Yeah, and even that, I think she says here, and we'll see in some of the notes, is, I guess, like fallible in terms of nonfiction reporting, because it's like an unreliable memory.
So what made you reverse the flow of the show and read that kind of summation before we even got into kind of a subjective, how you doing right now, what this make you think of intro?
So I read this book, and I'll start off by saying, like, I knew about this book because you had told me about it, but also because the year it came out, it was lauded. It won awards. It was on many people's top 10 graphic novel lists of the year. It was celebrated in the comics community at large. And as I was reading it, I was like, I don't quite understand why this is so celebrated. And also, it feels to me like there is something burbling under the surface here that Walden isn't addressing. That there's like a between the lines, in this case, between the gutters, between the panels, there was like an unspoken premise that there was something about her life growing up that was very dysfunctional, and she doesn't quite address it head on, but it pops up in glimpses here or there. And I kept thinking, as I was reading it, oh, she's eventually going to tie these glimpses together. She will have figured out what was wrong. And the book ends, and that is not the case. And so it made me sad when I finished the book, because I was like, oh, like, this is a woman who's out there who may still feel unloved in some ways and doesn't quite understand why. And then I read the author's note at the very end, and I was like, oh, like she all but says, oh, hey, I don't quite know what I was doing here, but you figure it out. You tell me what you walk away from it with. And we'll talk about this throughout the notes here about this book, because in most of the interviews, she says similar things along the lines of, I've put this book out here in the world, and I am no longer willing to talk about my family. When people ask her questions like, what did your mom think about the book? She very sternly puts her foot down and says, I will not talk about my family. The part of my life that I put in the memoir is available to talk about, but I will not talk about my private life in support of promoting this book.
Let me go to her website. I want to read something to you from her contact page.
Okay.
There's an email address for her agent, and then below that is this pair of sentences. If you want to talk to me directly, the only way is to send me a letter. I will try my best to get back to you. And then there's a P.O. box.
Okay.
So she's put a very particular barrier between herself and her audience.
Mm-hmm. I know other authors who do that
these days.
Yeah. Whenever I hear somebody do that, I feel like it's they're purposely putting up that extra barrier so that whoever is going to write them has to think about what they're saying before they say it, where it's very easy not to think about what you're saying when you're on Twitter or email.
Yeah, and even more so, I think it's what happens when you don't have to think about what you're saying. Because Neil Stephenson, who is very different from Tillie Walden, he has the same sort of email attitude. He says, I cannot be online. I can't have email available to people because I would get no work done.
Yeah, and I could totally see why.
Insignificant effort, yeah. And, we're not exactly burying the lead here, but Tillie Walden's spinning and her existence right now as an artist is almost like a timeline, because she started very young as a professional graphic novelist.
Yeah, and we do need to put that out there. So
we're watching her figure this out.
Yeah, and that was in my head as I was reading it, and I think we were talking about this off air, but I think her age was definitely in the mind of her book publishers. When they signed her up to do this book, they knew that it would be a PR tagline to be like, can you believe it? This girl who's only, what was she, 19 when she did this book? Something like that. Created this magnum opus, right? And it was, sure enough, like when I was going through and pulling up the research, like they were talking about the awards that it got, and it was like, oh, it's not just that she won an award. She's the youngest person to ever win this award, things like that.
Right.
It's kind of the Zadie Smith of comics.
Yeah. And she has continued to work too. This is not the end point.
Mm-mm.
She's had several graphic novels after spinning, and in fact, one just came out this year.
Yeah, and I would point out too, we usually wait until later in the episode to say this, but like, we are two middle-aged, straight, white dudes talking about a book. We're not reviewing a book, but we're talking about how it was made and how it was received. This is a book by somebody who could have been our child. Like, it's possible that you and I are old enough to be this human being's father.
Yeah, but we would have had to adopt in a state that would be okay with us to adopt together.
That's true. Together, we probably couldn't have done it. Sorry, Tillie. But my point is that, like, we are definitely generationally removed from her experience, and this is a book that is a coming-of-age story about being a young woman in modern America and a coming-out story.
Yeah. And the figure skating part of it, the spinning comes from the sort of discipline of figure skating. That was actually the most compelling thing to me when I started to read it.
Mm-hmm.
I am the father of 2 daughters, along with my son. And I have been planning, I guess, to come to grips with not understanding what it's like to grow up as a young woman.
Yeah. I had a feeling that this hit you harder than me because of your daughters.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, yes, except hit is not exactly what I would say. I was much more interested in what I didn't understand about it.
Yeah.
Because I had daughters. And because they do gymnastics and ballet. And they have, beyond just their activities that are like scouts or school, they have these very precise physical regimens, right, that seem to then fit into the model of figure skating.
So this is actually something I wanted to ask you, because as I was reading the book, one of the things that struck me as sort of a between the lines thing that wasn't really addressed was it seemed like her parents put a lot of pressure on her to excel at everything, both in terms of grades and after school activities. Not only was she getting up first thing in the morning to do ice skating and then going and doing synchronized skating immediately after school, but she also, you know, we see in the book that she's doing other extracurricular activities like playing music or whatnot, you know, like things that I see and I go, well, okay, either the parents are trying to make her a well-rounded human being or they're trying to keep her out of the house. And I wanted to ask you, like, as you were reading it, did that all seem normal to you, or did it seem like she was just constantly doing stuff?
No, it made sense to me. If I look at the gymnastics training that my kids all do, there are levels that you could kind of classify as having a good time, becoming a better athlete, or just becoming more in tune with your body levels. Yeah. And then there's competitive. And competitive is crazy compared to the just for fun. But the line that you cross is early. LJ got like recruited into the first level of the getting kind of crazy competitive classes. Mm-hmm. And if she keeps going on the path she's on, we're going to get to a place where we're going to have to say, do you want to do 2.5 hour practices each week? Mm-hmm. And if so, we're going to have to take something else out. You know, we can't, or we're going to have to start splitting up our parental duties, and someone's going to have to handle soccer with the twins, and someone's going to have to handle gymnastics with Lila. And none of that feels crazy in my house. Okay. This does not feel like, oh, wow, we're really just over-programming them. There's a part of knowing what's coming in terms of adolescence, in terms of boredom, in terms of frustration. And the more you point your children outward into the world and give them the resources to indulge in various like disciplines or explorations or controlled disorientation and experience, you know, the more you give that to your kids, the better off they'll probably be in terms of not being a crazy person in the house and trying to find something to occupy themselves, like blowing up eggs with bottle rockets.
Okay. I would say, though, then that this book triggered me and my particular problems with my own family, in that it seemed to me like she was being pushed too hard and that she was slowly coming to that awareness but never really quite said it in the book. And then there's a point in the book where her mother starts complaining about having to pay for all the things that they're making her do, that they've put her on this path for. And that struck me as even more egregious, that it was like, well, you've set your kid up on this path, you've done this on purpose, and now you're putting the financial burden of guilt on her.
Yeah, I haven't gotten to that part of it yet. You know, everybody is very happy to be doing the activities they're doing. There is going to be a place, though, in our lives where we've put a lot of effort into something. So if one of the kids has a week or two where they're like, I think I'm done with soccer, I'm just tired of it. Mm-hmm. The back of my head feeling is going to be, we have like $300 worth of soccer equipment, you know, that we've bought for this year. and we paid the fees, you're going to have to at least go through this year that you've committed to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you can tell me at the end of this season if you want out. By the time you get to the end of the season, it's over. Some of that, I don't want to be part of it, is sort of released. And then, hell, I have signed up for a ton of stuff that I didn't want to do when I got to the actual doing of it. You know, it just sounded good when I heard about it, you know? And I think kids are really susceptible to that.
Okay.
So I guess what I'm saying is that the motivations and the conditions of all the things that you're seeing, they're a mess compared to the sort of, well, it seems like her parents were really pushing her. And then they started talking to her about money, which was some kind of like betrayal of their pushing. It's like there's probably 6 different pressures to that particular incident, you know?
Yeah, and I kept feeling like things like that were going to be, I don't know about resolved, but at least addressed directly. Okay, so we're going backwards here. We're talking about themes at the top rather than at the end of the episode. Let's put a flag down. This is a graphic novel memoir by cartoonist Tillie Walden. It's a coming-of-age story. It's about growing up and figure skating and coming out of the closet. It came out in 2017. And this is kind of the best summary that I found of it, Charlie, from Alex Wong writing about it in the Comics Journal. Wong says, Tillie Walden's Spinning is a first-person memoir that focuses on the author's years-long relationship with competitive figure skating growing up, first in New Jersey and then in Austin, Texas. But figure skating is just a backdrop. Spinning explores Walden's memories growing up and how she deals with being gay, coming out to the people close to her, her first love, and learning to grow up and leave things behind. It is a powerful memoir in which Walden is unafraid to explore the most painful moments of adolescence with a maturity that is striking and admirable for her age. She just turned 21 earlier this year, so this was when the book came out. I think she started working on the book when she was 19 because she was, well, we'll get to it, but she was in school.
Yeah. There's something about the phrase unafraid to explore and maturity that I think rings very false to you.
I wouldn't say false. I do think that she's mature, and I do think it's admirable that she produced this work for her age. I think that there are definite things in this book that seem like painful moments that she doesn't address, and that seemed like things that would be addressed in a memoir. It was as if the narrative were on a road, and you read a certain amount of stories like this, you get these setup moments and you think, okay, that's going to pay off down the road. And they don't. Instead of addressing it, like the car veers off the road and into the dirt for a little bit, and then it comes back onto the road. There are specific things in this book that she clearly said, I'm not going to talk about that in this book.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about how it was made. And I think we'll find some of the rationale or strategies that brought her to a work that operated the way you just described. So Tillie Walden, she was born in 1996. We've established that she's young. She was influenced by reading a lot of manga, comic books from Japan. And as we found later in the research, her dad was sort of a pusher, a manga pusher for her.
Mm-hmm.
Now, she was in high school, and she was discovered, quote unquote, discovered by the British publisher Avery Hill Publishing when she was working on her first graphic novel, The End of Summer. Avery Hill Publishing, some representative of that company, saw her stuff up on the internet. And her stuff was up on the internet because her dad pushed her to put it up there. Mm-hmm. And I think that sets the frame of this pushing too hard thing.
Mm-hmm.
Along with manga, she was also influenced by folks like Alison Bechdel, Craig Thompson, and David Small, who all did their own graphic memoirs. And as I said, she kept publishing after Spinning. Her other books are I Love This Part, A City Inside, On a Sunbeam, and Are You Listening? Now, I read On a Sunbeam. I liked that one, too.
That's the one that came out directly after this?
Right. But it's a science fiction story, and a very impressionistic science fiction story. Very, floating cities in space.
Okay.
And planets that you can't go home to kind of thing. The newest book, Are You Listening? That's more like returning to this spinning kind of area of exploration. It's about much more naturalistic, sort of psychological examination.
Okay. Walden, after she had her first book published, went to the Center for Cartoon Studies. And this book that we're talking about today, Spinning, was her thesis from going to school there. So CCS is a 2-year institution. It focuses on sequential art, and it's located in Hartford, Vermont. It was founded in 2004 by James Term and Michelle Ollie. And they've said their focus is they're not focused on the quality of the drawing as much as they are on critical thinking skills, literary merit, storytelling ability, and curiosity. And they make sure that when they're teaching their students how to make comics and cartoons, that they teach them all aspects of comics production. So they learn everything. They learn lettering, they learn coloring, they learn scripting, and even the publishing aspects and printing aspects, because they feel like that is the experience of doing alternative comics rather than mainstream comics. And this comes from the faculty there, but it also comes from the fact that Peter Laird is apparently one of the significant donors to this school. And if you're unfamiliar with him, Peter Laird is one of the guys who created Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. He has gone from the sort of black and white zine world of comics to having, big budget movies and cartoons and toys made out of the, things he imagined.
Right. I find the Center for Cartoon Studies really interesting because it's like the opposite of something like Juilliard. You don't show that you have ability and go to hone it and become the best at some particular thing that you do. It's more like if you're interested in cartooning, writing comics, you can come here and we'll teach you how to handle the business, how to handle every part of it. So you'll know when you work with someone what they're doing too. It's almost a trade school.
It sounds really good on paper. I'm curious. I don't know a lot about CCS and how well its graduates do, but one of the things that I hear often in the comics community is the complaint that schools that have specific sequential art programs don't prepare their students enough for the reality of the publishing world and what it actually means to be a working artist or storyteller in comics.
Well, here's what Tillie Walden says about the Center for Cartoon Studies. Studying at CCS has been wonderful. I'm just living a life that's full of comics all the time. It can be hard at times because you're living and studying in a space that is so full of creative work, but I think ultimately it's very rewarding. The most surprising lesson was just how vast the history of comics is. I went into my class with Steve Bissett, knowing basically nothing about the history, and Steve changed all that. It was a great thing to learn. It made me feel like I was a part of a longer history, rather than just being a non-existent entity drawing comics in a timeless vacuum.
So this quote was kind of interesting to me because we know that she was producing the beginnings of spinning while she was taking classes like this. And part of me wonders if that explains some of the formalism of spinning, because there are a lot of moments when I'm reading it where I feel like, she hasn't really thought out the storytelling pacing panel to panel here. And then all of a sudden, sort of towards the end, there'll be some like really cool moments where you're like, oh wow, she really thought about the impact here and like blowing up to a splash page or using a bunch of tiny panels or something like that.
Yeah, and this is her thesis, and it was written in pieces. There was the thesis part, and then there was the edited part, and then the final published version.
Yeah, it does. It feels like in the middle, she learned about the history and formalism part of comics, and then went in and added that to this book afterward, or maybe as she was going along.
Well, when it came out, she said, it feels like centuries ago that this book was just my thesis. It was the project I worked on and graduated with in my second year at CCS. It slowly grew throughout the year. The scope of the project kept getting wider. After I graduated from school and made a deal with First Second Books, which is the eventual publisher of Spinning, my editor, Connie Sue, helped me turn the skeleton into the 400-page graphic novel that you can read now.
We should also mention, this is a big book. It reads very quickly, but it is a big, thick graphic novel.
And it wasn't published issue by issue and then collected. It was written to be a graphic novel.
Mm-hmm. So her father, we mentioned, has been pretty influential on her. She says in multiple interviews he put comics in front of her. He kind of was the one who got her into manga, but he's also the one who encouraged her to put her work online. That is how she was discovered. Apparently Avery Hill Publishing, they're based in Britain. They emailed her while she was still in high school, and they said, "Do you want to work with us?" And she panicked, and she said, "I thought it was a scam." And she told them she had too much to do her senior year, and that they should get back to her after she's graduated.
So this was around 2004, 2003, just going by her age in high school. So the internet, putting your work up on the web was not the sort of, you put it on Tumblr and someone found it.
Right.
They had to make a point to put stuff up. I don't know exactly where.
This is like the period of time that's like the height of webcomics, when people were using like WordPress packages to put their comics up on a blog or something like that, and we're getting a lot of readers. Now there's so many avenues for so many different types of comics digitally that it's spread a little thinner than it was.
Yeah. Avery Hill did wait for her, and after she'd graduated from high school, her first graphic novel, The End of Summer, was published.
Mm-hmm. So she talks some more about her dad. She says that there's some moments that really encouraged her to get to the point that she did so she could produce Spinning. One is that she says her father never said, "You need to do this. This is going to be your career." What he did was he put material in front of her and was basically like, take what you will from it. And one of those things is he signed her up for a workshop with Scott McCloud. And she found that to be a big turning point, that she took this class. McCloud convinced her, I do want to be a cartoonist. And she says, my parents are supportive of everything I do. It's amazing. I didn't realize how significant it was that my father was getting me books and signing me up for workshops. Now I realize how important it was.
Now, going back to our, dumb parent and non-parent discussion at the beginning, the idea that she can look back, less than 5 years and say, I didn't realize what was happening at the time that I was being guided or that I was being given these resources.
Mm-hmm.
That's terrifying as a parent.
Mm-hmm.
I want to check in with my kids. I want to make sure that I know what they want and that I'm sort of helping them along. But also, kids know nothing, right? Unless you teach them to.
No, that's what I kept thinking is there were a lot of formative experiences for me at the age that she was at that I did not realize at the time were how important they were, right? Like, for instance, I lived overseas when I was in high school. I didn't realize how much that impacted my character until I was probably in my mid to late 20s. So going back to Tillie Walden, she says that she first started working on Spinning just before her second year at that school, and that the idea came at the end of her first year. She was trying to do a short comic about ice skating. And she said, when I was working on it, I totally froze up. I found I had way too much baggage with skating to even make a small comic about it. And I'm the kind of person where if there's something I can't do, I want to do it. So I embarked on a journey to create a book about skating because there was something that was holding me back.
Do you relate to that?
I do. Do you think after reading the book that you know what the something was that was holding her back, or that she knows what the something was that was holding her back?
I mean, after reading the book, I don't feel like I've been granted some meaning, or I've been granted some knowledge that she crafted and handed off to me.
Mm-hmm.
But I definitely can relate to her talking about figure skating as something really important, that to her, foundational to her personality and what she enjoys and what she doesn't like anymore in her life.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of, say, writing or making a comic about something that big in your life. I'm thinking of myself too. And discovering that, I can't just do this in small pieces.
Yeah.
This is impossible. I feel like I'm leaving everything out. I mean, we're having this conversation for a podcast, and already it's like, oh, we've left so much stuff behind.
Mm-hmm.
We could talk about my fears as a parent for a couple hours. We could just talk about like,
I don't get paid enough for that.
Yeah. So why did you read this book? It's like, well, it was recommended casually by a Twitter, feed somewhere. I was like, oh, cool. I need to check more stuff out.
Mm-hmm.
And when I found it, it was really compelling because here was a young woman telling her story with her own voice, with her own set of, her own lens, right? The thing that she cared about was in the book and nothing else was. So that was super powerful. Like, this is a perspective that I will encounter soon that I have no point of reference for.
So I think then one of the big questions that comes up for me that maybe is part of us exploring this book, but also I have to admit, like, I don't know a lot about this, is what is the purpose of memoir? I have not read a lot of memoir, and I'm not sure about what the sort of current, zeitgeist status of it is in publishing. But to me, it feels like at least it should be a nonfiction telling of something that happened to you, but that there should be more to it than just the telling. That there should be larger themes that come together that you can reflect upon critically. Like, I go back to what the Cartoon Center for Studies said. They want these students to focus on their storytelling abilities, and they want them to focus on their critical thinking rather than on their drawing ability. And so when I read a memoir like this, I guess I have higher expectations for what I think it's supposed to be. Maybe you know more about this than I do, because I really don't read a ton of memoir, but it feels to me like the expectation with memoir is like, okay, great, we're all going to reflect on this thing that happened to you, and we will learn from it. And I don't know what I was supposed to learn from this, other than this is what it's like to be a young girl ice skating in Austin, Texas, and having to come out of the closet to her family.
And so did you feel that by declaring it memoir, there was sort of an extra level of difficulty that had to be reached as opposed to fiction?
No. In fact, I feel like in a lot of fiction, the expectation of themes is stronger.
Huh. But then the expectation of, like, clear messaging is lower.
Possibly. Yeah, I'm not sure. I come across a lot of memoir for my day job, and I meet a lot of people who write memoirs. And I still haven't figured this out. Like, what is the... I know there are entire classes that are taught on nonfiction and memoir writing.
Yes.
But I haven't quite figured out, like, what is the ultimate goal with this kind of storytelling? Is it the same thing as with other storytelling in that we're trying to make sense of the world, and this is just another facet, another reflection of it? And if so, what type of sense did Tillie Walden make of the world through spinning?
So I feel like you're being a very conservative reader of memoir. You're like someone saying, I listened to this punk rock and I just don't know, what am I supposed to feel? What am I supposed to think?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know that a song is supposed to, bring forth certain images and a story in a melodic, pleasing way. And what are they doing? I feel like there should be more to that. That's
so
what
you're
I'm
saying. You're talking about style now. You're saying that, like, there's something to the style in which the story is presented that's inherent to what makes it good, right?
Yeah.
And in this case, then, that it's something about the way that Tillie Walden draws, tells the story, and frames her panels and storytelling.
Yeah, the decisions made on what to leave out, what to leave in, and what you ask the reader to just sort of take away and chew on.
Okay.
I want to give a quick shout out to one of our patrons, Beth Barnett. I got her collection Anxiety Diaries.
Yeah.
And I really like it. And it's real short bursts. You know, they're almost like jokes or web comics. In fact, I think they were web comics. Beth, you can tell me differently. But they're a finely honed moment delivered in this comic.
Yeah.
And I feel like I know her more now that I've read that. And also there is a different set of analogies or imagery to connect to some of my own anxieties or understandings of anxiety.
Okay. So it did work that way for you then. You know, she told a story. Beth told a story. Tillie Walden told a story. It was about how they're making sense of the world. You looked at that and you went, oh, I see. That's a way that I haven't seen before, but this is how it syncs up with how I make sense of the world.
It was an incremental empathetic move.
Okay.
You know, towards one person's viewpoint in each case. And the reason I started thinking about that, the relationship, say, between more formal classical music and punk rock, and the idea of, oh, you know, are you mistaking the genre for a particular kind of purpose? Are you, you know, is there a kind of conservative critique that comes from this is not doing it the way it's quote unquote supposed to? All that came from looking at how Walden described her process and how much like fiction it was. That she wasn't saying, I had the story complete in my head and I'm trying to render it.
Yeah.
But more that she was finding her way to whatever the story might be. Like she said that she would write maybe 50 pages or, you know, draw 50 pages and then ditch up, you know, 20 of them, having done some work, having found her way towards something, and then continuing again.
You know, one thing that I think I want to make clear too is that it sort of sounds like from the way that we're talking as if I only read mainstream comics and I'm like, don't understand alt comics. And I have read lots of alternative comics and lots of alternative comics memoirs. Like I would say Eleanor Davis is one of my favorite comics creators, and much of her work is autobiographical and is done in a way similar to Walden in that, like, she's purposely drawing very loosely and not using a lot of framework in order to tell the story the way she wants to. I don't know what it is about this book that didn't quite get all the way there for me. But I think that there might be a hint of it in this quote from her. She starts talking about drawing and how she draws for a book like this and how she thought about perfection and how she was putting things together. This is one thing that struck me as incredibly odd because I've never heard any comics people I know talk about making comics like this. She said just for this book, she made 50 pages of it for her thesis. And she said that she'll probably only use 30 of those 50 pages for the finished book because making 20 bad pages is still good because I'm being productive. That is so different from everybody else I know who makes comics. They don't throw away their pages. If they do, that's a huge sacrifice, you know? In comics making, oftentimes there's a lot of planning ahead in terms of how many pages you have and where you're going with the story on each page and with each panel. And that was something that I felt from Spinning, was that because of the nature of how this book was produced by the publisher, she was able to just say, cool, I'm just going to draw. I'm going to just draw, and whatever works, whatever doesn't gets thrown away. And I'll either redo it or it won't be in the book. And the page count, I mean, 400 pages of comics, that's a lot, you know? Like, most people would, like, give an arm to be able to tell comics that long, you know? And so it's really fascinating to see. This is kind of, when we talk about prose writing on the show, this is seat of the pants writing done as comics.
Mm-hmm. And that's where that loose drawing style really helps, because you can imagine her kind of sketching a page that she can ditch.
Yeah, and there are some
quickly.
pages. Yeah, exactly. I mean, here's my common sense thinking when I think about producing comics. It takes about a day's worth of work to produce a page. So when I hear her say, I just threw 20 pages away, I go, holy shit, that's like almost a month's work. And
but she was in school, right? And there's also how good were those pages? How finished were those pages?
Exactly. And you can see that throughout the book. One of the things that's kind of fascinating about the book are the choices that she makes on where to include detail and how she uses detail to tell the story. There are some panels where the way that she renders figures, it's very clear that like she could bang out a page in probably like an hour, right? Mm-hmm. Then there's other pages. I'm looking specifically at page 139, which every article I read about this book used this page, which is a huge splash page where she has meticulously drawn the interior of an ice skating rink. And she's done it all to perspective. And there's a huge grid on the windows, and she's got all the beams and the ceilings aligned perfectly. That probably took a day or two just to do that page. And so it's interesting to see how she shifts gears from where she decides to place detail and where she decides not to.
Now that leads us to this set of quotes. She says, "I like backgrounds because I like making stories where it feels like you have to go somewhere, and backgrounds are usually the way to do that." So what I hear when you describe that page is that here's one thing that she planned out. She said, "I knew I needed to lay out this ice skating rink," and she knows what it looks like. She's not discovering something as she's going.
Yeah.
But then she talks about how her strongest stories come when she puts a part of herself and her experience into them. She talks about being sick as a child, having heart issues, breathing issues, and that's where she sort of pulls this kind of wandering mind from.
Yeah.
She said, "I couldn't bear to think about all the school I was missing. I couldn't bear to think about what was going on with my body. So I just lay there and dreamily thought of stories and places and tried to take myself anywhere but the hospital. When I draw a character going through something that I went through, it makes me feel weirdly less alone, and it helps me make it a lighter subject. It becomes less of an experience that I had and more of a magical thing."
So this was my takeaway from that quote. I thought immediately, why isn't this in Spinning? Spinning is a memoir of her experience coming of age, growing up, and this sounds like it was a major part of her life and her identity. She thinks very, not fondly, but she thinks back on that as like a character building moment, right? And yet it's not in this book at all. She talks about it casually in this interview. Maybe it's going to be in another memoir. But I think what I'm getting at here is that I wanted more focus from this book. The pages that are focused are the ones that work the best for me. There are moments like we talked about the way that she renders backgrounds. There's other pages where there's no backgrounds at all. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of pages where there's no backgrounds at all. There's also, we should throw this out here. One of the conceits of the book is every chapter begins with a demonstration of a different move in ice skating. And that move is supposed to somehow resonate metaphorically with what goes on in the chapter. I loved that. I thought that was great. I was like, oh, awesome. This is like this is a thing only comics can do, right? Like you couldn't really do that in another medium. But then it'll veer wildly into these kind of 10, 15 page meandering sections where I'm like, I'm not quite sure what I'm supposed to take away from this. Here's another section that I think she killed it. Pages 66 through 67. She's talking about the marks that you leave on the ice when you're performing the various moves. And she draws herself skating and then draws these grids of what the marks look like and how the marks are surrounding her body as she explains what was going on with her personally in that period of time. These two pages are printed unlike any other pages in the book in that they are entirely yellow. All the other pages are white. This is clearly supposed to be a very strong moment in the story where we're supposed to stop and go, aha. And I loved it. There wasn't enough of that in here for me.
Well, if I can snap you out of it and bring you back to super context land and talk about production instead of a review, right? What do each of these pieces kind of show us about how she made it? She made it in these like 3 different layers.
Yeah.
And each layer had a different set of concerns. Like her thesis time, she talked about drawing scenes and spinning and crying while she was doing it. It was like very much a pure therapy kind of.
Yeah, let's go through this. This quote is really strong.
Yeah.
This is another thing, again, like reading about it really affected me. She says, producing this book was very hard. There isn't a lot more than that. It hurt. At times it felt impossible to move forward. I got through it. There were scenes in spinning where I cried the entire time that I drew it. My pen was moving. It was getting done, but I wouldn't stop crying. And when I finished drawing the scene, the tears ran out and I felt better. That is powerful shit.
But
that's not in the book.
Catharsis of doing the story.
Yeah.
That thing you said about the using the figure skating moves at the beginning, that came after. That was brought into it by an editor suggesting, I feel like you can find a way to frame these chapters.
Exactly. So this is one of my points, right? Is that like a lot of the things where the book is focused are because this editor came along, and a lot of points, and we're saying this because Walden herself cites this in the interviews, that the editor tells her, you need to do things like this. You need to do these chapter points. You need to do these detailed backgrounds here or there, or else it's getting lost.
And the idea that there are sections that are so different, right, in the book. I feel like this is the layers of composition, the layers of editing. Like you can see the process.
And so a question for me that came up about the production of this book was, how much of this is Tillie Walden and how much of it is the editorial team at First Second?
Well, I have an answer for that. So Tillie Walden said, when I was working on this memoir, I was very lacking in confidence, mostly just because it was a type of storytelling I had never done before. It's quite an undertaking to try and turn your own life into a cohesive narrative, because life rarely plays out exactly as it should for a book. Now, that is the core of your, we'll just call it a complaint, about the memoir, is that it doesn't seem to hop over that particular obstacle to memoir writing. And if you don't make your life work like a story, you're not writing a memoir.
I mean, I think and this is my question, maybe some of our listeners who know more about memoir or nonfiction can tell me, is there a difference in memoir writing between, say, reporting what happened and presenting an idea? Something larger where there's like a synthesis of the information that's presented and an application of that. This seems to me that it's other than the bits that we've pointed out that are from the editor, right? That it's a very straight reporting. This is what it was like that day when I went to ice skating. This was like what it was like when I met my first girlfriend. This is what it was like when I talked to my mother. The moments themselves are reported to us, but there isn't any reflection on the moments.
So I stopped in the middle of a long quote to have that moment with you. Let me continue. The book changed a lot between when I first drew it to the final form. First time I drew spinning, it was a 100-page story in black and white. That was the skeleton version of the book. My editor at First Second held my hand as I explored all of these memories and helped me turn it into a book. So the answer in a lot of ways is it's the editor. All right, this was a true editor-writer relationship. Walden says she was impatient with the process. She just wanted it to be done, and her editor was slowing her down and telling her, go further down, go deeper into moments. This is a start of something, not the end of something.
Yeah, that's
Walden's
fascinating, right? How much influence this editor had on the content.
The editor, this is Walden explaining the editor. She would tell me I was touching on something that was leading to something more, and pushed me to dive deeper into my story, to seek out connections between things. At the beginning, I looked at my story as individual events. Here's what you were talking about. And not anything that was connected. But she helped push me to draw lines between things, to build something that was more cohesive.
Okay. So what I'm hearing from Walden in these interview bits is that her intention was just to report on the events, and she wanted to do something that was much shorter than this was. And the editor and first second behind the editor were like, here are some things that we need you to do to make this literary so that we can sell it in the markets that we want to sell it in. It needs to be longer. You need to flesh out the scenes. They need more pages, but also like a longer deeper digging into the actual events themselves. And then you need to apply some sort of symbolism. Let's use the figure skating stuff as like a good way to sort of, as a symbol for what you were going through emotionally at that time.
Right. But, I mean, the start of it was specifically figure skating. So you're talking about that particular chapter beginning with the move stuff, right?
Well, yes, but then they do it in every chapter. Every single chapter begins that way afterward, yeah. Like here's chapter 3 where she talks about the flip jump, and she says, I loved flips. You would launch yourself into the air by slamming the tip of your blade into the ice. And then chapter 3 begins.
Yeah. So she started doing spinning as a very specific to young figure skater training, right? And probably her coming out story also, maybe that was just, impossible to leave out of, a comic book about herself. And then it was taken by an editor and sort of all of the things that you're saying, aren't these important to a memoir? Those were sort of applied to it.
Yeah.
And Tillie was guided through that process.
But if it were up to her, they wouldn't have been there probably, and it would have been a much shorter book.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Because she was 20.
Right. Yeah. Imagine producing a piece of work this big when you're 20. And that's the question the publisher wants us to ask too, right? Like when you pick it up, they want you to go, my word, can you believe that she did this at her age? And it is true. Like it's a really remarkable accomplishment. But it's also, as I was reading it, I thought, I can't wait to read what she writes 10 years from now.
I have to admit that I never had a moment of saying, wow, look at this trick this kid pulled off. Look at this young person doing this.
What were you doing when you were 19?
Well, not this.
I was like playing in bands and barely making it through college and working in a shitty kitchen in a restaurant making salads for people.
Yeah, but I don't compare the possibilities of the human experience to my own stunted growth, you know?
I think I'm just trying to imagine having the maturity to objectively reflect on what had happened to me in the last 10 years of my life and then put that into narrative form for other people to consume. I was definitely not ready for that at that age.
And yet also you're saying that she wasn't, right? I mean, that's the thing.
I think she was way more ready than I was, but I think honestly that her age is a factor here and that there would be more to this story if she told it later in her life.
She started in a journalistic place.
Mm-hmm.
You know, she said she wanted to highlight the standards that young girls are held up to, especially in a kind of done-up sport like figure skating.
Yeah.
She says, the amount of makeup we wear, the dresses we wear, it's so ridiculous and stupid. Ice skating is a winter sport and we dress like it's tennis. So she was staying out of her own personal shit, right, to begin with. She said, I wanted to talk about an authentic ice skating experience because there's a lot of bullshit in the sport and the industry. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until she got pushed into writing scenes where she ended up crying the whole time that this memoir began to take form.
Yeah, I would say if you asked me what this book is about, I would say ice skating is not even one of the top 3 things that it's about. Ice skating is a backdrop to this book. It is the setting and a form of symbolism for what's going on in her life as she's growing up. And that's very interesting. But it is sort of presented as if like that's the selling point. Like, oh, you want to read what it's like to be a young girl in competitive figure skating? And it's not really that. So let's speed along here about the production so we can talk a little bit more about the industry stuff. But one of the things about the production that's connected to the industry stuff is Walden talking about how important manga was to her in terms of how she draws. And she cites 3 different creators as being really influential on her. One is Scott McCloud, one is Winsor McCay, and then the other is just broadly manga. She talks about how she read Hunter x Hunter, Hikaru no Go, and Dragon Ball, all when she was a kid. And the reason why that is important to how this book is presented is she says all of those were in black and white. And people don't know how important that is when you're a young artist. I was able to see the simplicity of their black lines and how you could create a world that way. I learned everything about drawing from manga. And you can definitely see that. She doesn't have a manga aesthetic, but you can see that in the way that she renders this book, in that she's clearly very focused on line and blacks and negative space. There's not a lot of room for gradients, or there is watercolor throughout here. She uses it, but it's sparing, I would say. And the other thing that's really interesting about this book's production, Charlie, I don't know if you noticed this, but it's printed in 2 colors. So it's printed in yellow and purple. There's no black line. All of the blacks are printed in a dark purple. And then they use, for the watercolor parts, it's like a gradation of that purple. And then she uses yellow for certain effects, like when the sun is coming out, or she wants to draw your attention to something in a panel. So Charlie, another thing I'm wondering then is, like, a lot of people who aren't like comics folk, I hear complain about comics that aren't in full color, that like for some reason they don't feel like they're real to them. That didn't affect you in any way?
No. Another reason I was so affectionate to this book is because it was an incomplete style.
Yeah.
That I could relate to. There are a bunch of comics that I've tried to read, and the way that they have not been naturalistic, or not been, I don't know what the word would be, thorough, has made me just feel like, nope, I can't handle this, right?
Okay.
And this is pushing me away. This was loose enough and open enough, Tillie Walden style.
Yeah.
Almost ethereal enough that I could enjoy it despite it not being concrete enough to really get every image across to me. She talks about Winsor McCay being an influence. I've tried to read the Little Nemo cartoons, and they just push me away.
Really?
That particular drawing style, it's like, I think, a harsh tone in music for some people. Like, I just can't hear that. That irritates me.
Yeah, Winsor McCay, I was actually surprised when she mentioned how big of an influence Winsor McCay was, because I love his work. And she says here that he was a big influence on her because her dad got her one of the really big collections of Winsor McCay's work. Which he means by this, if you're unfamiliar, Winsor McCay is a turn-of-the-century cartoonist who drew newspaper strips, primarily known for this book, Little Nemo and Slumberland. And so they were printed on tabloid-side sheets, and they were just these huge one-page comics. And so when you get them collected, the books are tabloid size, but it's like a collection of like 3 or 4 years worth of these comics. So it's just this huge tome. The local comic book store here that I really admire, Floating World, they have this massive collection of all of Little Nemo up on the top shelf, and it's $500. It's like this huge box.
Yeah.
And every time I go in, I'm like, oh, that's tempting. But what am I going to do with that beast, So it's interesting to hear you say that, because I think I think of McCay as like a godfather of modern comics. So it's really interesting to hear how difficult it is for you to look at it.
Yeah. And I should point out, it's not like I think it's bad. It's just not to my taste.
Yeah. I could see, though, it's like an overwhelming, like you're getting bombarded with information.
Yeah.
And another thing about McCay is like the way that he does panel layouts is very different from the traditional language of comics that we've come to understand it today. And so the transitions from panel to panel are sometimes very jarring as well.
I didn't take notes on my experience, so I cannot confirm or deny these particulars.
So Walden actually says, she talks about the conversations that she and the people at First Second had about like the intentions behind this book and what the product was going to look like on shelves. She said, I had a conversation with them. about how much time I would have to do it. And I wanted the book to be complete. And in order to do it, it would have to be done very quickly. But they didn't push me to do that. And I said, wait, I'm bored of going slow. Let me draw this book quickly. So she wanted to just bang this thing out after she graduated. She said in 3 months, she drew all of the pages that you're reading now. It was a lot of fun, and it made me feel more like myself.
So when I was reading the book, I did not think to myself, oh, a young person made this, and look, it's still kind of hanging together. But every quote of hers that we read in this, I think, man, what a young person's attitude towards stuff, you know?
Yeah.
Like saying, I'm so bored of going slow to get this right. You know, it's like, it's so interesting to see now very clearly the youthful attitude that was bouncing back and forth between her and her editor.
Yeah, yeah. And remember what I said earlier, like the common, almost every comics cartoonist I know, the standard is they try to get a page done a day. And like they feel like if they're doing more than that, they're probably putting too much detail into it, okay? And that's usually pencils and maybe inks, not colors. I just did the math. She said she drew 400 pages in 3 months. That means she did 4 to 5 pages a day. That's crazy fast. Now, one thing to keep in mind is she'd already laid out like 50 some odd pages of it for her thesis. So that's helpful.
And she'd been working on it for 2 years as a thesis and thought about it over and over again.
Dude, like the speed in which this was produced is jarring to me.
You know, I feel like we're all over the place. So much of this is a kind of what didn't work, what did work, back and forth, back and forth.
Yeah, that's okay, right?
Totally, but it's like I'm trying to follow you. Like, which way are we going? Did this work for you or not work for you?
How about we follow Tillie Walden instead? I mean, I would say that's part of my take on this book is that I love it, and it does work in some ways, but I expected more from it. And I don't feel like just because it, you know, I think it's getting a pass in a lot of ways because of how it was presented. Whereas like I think there is some critique to be done here. Like there are things that could have been tightened up. The drawing style could have been a little bit more meticulous. There should have been more thought put into the arrangement of story, whatever. But like, that's also on one hand, my subjective point of view, but also it's a difference in how much you and I have both read too in this medium, right? And that like, I like breathe the medium of comics, you know? And I think you read this and you're like, this is great. This is perfectly fine. And let's keep in mind, we're not there yet because we're still in production. This is going to be a long episode. This was not intended for a comics reading audience. This is intended for a bookstore literary reading audience.
For an NPR audience.
Well, yeah. In some ways, this is the kind of book that I refer to as an NPR graphic novel because it's the kind of thing that a host on an NPR show will go on and be like, this is so amazing. And it's like one of 3 graphic novels they've read.
And, you know, I read more than once in the stuff that we collected for the episode, people saying, comic books are not all superheroes.
Right. Yeah, that's also like the go-to for most of these things, right? Is that I used to have a professor who would say, I want us to get to a point where we can write about stories in this medium and the first paragraph doesn't have to be comic books aren't all about superheroes. Because that should just be common knowledge. It shouldn't be treated as this like esoteric thing that people only know about because of superhero movies.
So let's get back to Walden's sort of original goal or original sort of inspiration. She wanted to write about figure skating, right, in an almost journalistic way. She wanted to talk about how it created certain expectations in the way the girls looked. It created certain expectations in how the parents would act. She said, I wanted to talk about the way the parents acted, the way competition can drive everyone a little crazy. I just feel like so many people see ice skating as America's sweetheart sport, and there's so few ice skating stories that are realistic. And I do remember there's like an ice skating movie every couple of years, isn't there?
Yeah.
It just kind of like, it just tick, tick,
Sometimes it's a drama, sometimes it's a documentary, sometimes it's a comedy. But yeah, it's almost its own kind of genre.
And part of that, I think, is the motion. I'm being totally serious here.
Mm-hmm.
Ice skating as a way that two people interact is inherently kinetic and compelling. So if you have a love story between two skaters, you have a bunch of time where you can just put them on the ice and see them act out in a really ferocious way this competition.
In some ways, that's why everyone loves the Tanya Harding, Nancy Kerrigan story. It's like quintessentially American because it's kinetic, it's about movement, but at the same time, it's also about like betrayal and pettiness and false expectations, you know?
And Walden said that these stories aren't about the sport. And she wanted to talk about an authentic ice skating experience, meaning the ice skating experience, not a compelling story that has a backdrop of ice skating.
Yeah.
And she had kind of an expose idea. She said, I think a lot of the bullshit in ice skating comes from the fact that, quote, people higher up in figure skating really like figure skating's image as a pretty sport. And I don't think that's completely accurate. I'm not a figure skater anymore, and I don't care about protecting figure skating. And I think a lot of people in the sport do. I don't have to worry about that.
That right there is one of those moments where I'm like, that is an amazing thesis for this book. I did not get that from reading this book. I would have loved to have seen more of that in here.
Well, all this editorship, right?
Yeah.
All of this getting at the more therapeutic or the more sort of heart-wrenching stuff appears to have also shaved off the figure skating expose.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, at a point, like, it starts to make me wonder, like, how much of this was actually Tillie Walden's vision, you know, and how many compromises did she make with this book?
Well, she seemed ready and able to take in all of the feedback.
Mm-hmm.
She has a little anecdote here. My editor nudged me and said, I want you to think about doing something with the chapter pages. That's what you're talking about with the figure skating moves that get progressively more complicated. Every page in your book, the editor said, is an opportunity to contribute to the narrative. And Tillie Walden says her response was, I was like, oh, I guess you're right.
Again, very stunning to me because that's comics to me, right? Like, comics is about the economy of storytelling and how many pages you do or do not have to tell that story in. And so she is this prodigy, but she's also kind of like, well, the way that I tell these stories, I'm not thinking about it the same way other people think about the medium. I'm just kind of exploring.
Well, she's not a prodigy, right? That's the way that story has been kind of crafted.
That's
like,
the
look,
marketing
she's so young.
for the book. Yeah.
But she's not, by any definition, a prodigy.
She's not Mozart, but
words have meanings, Chris, right? So there's a difference between impressive, accomplished, and prodigy.
I think that's fair. I think you're right. So here, this gets to my question about memoirs, this next quote from her. She says, I know people approach memoir in lots of different ways. A lot of people look back at photos and journals, and they try to connect the dots. I'm pretty aware that memory is flawed, and that everyone has their own idea of what the truth is. I didn't want to set out to make a book to tell exactly what happened in my life as accurately as possible. Okay, so right there she's saying I wasn't reporting. Then she says, I didn't know if I could do that. What I felt like I could do was tell a story accurately of how I felt, and I do feel like I accomplished that. So in a way, like, this is more of a painting than a story. It's about her interior. It's about the internal. It's about her emotions, less than it's about the actual narrative of events taking place in a plot or a nonfiction story.
And she describes a lot of people having the same reaction that you did. She says, people are very eager to hear more about my story. There's a lot of my story that I'm willing to talk about, but I have to draw clear lines to keep some of my life to myself because so many people think that just because you're a memoirist, you're a very public person. I find that a lot of people expect it to be a continuing conversation, and in my mind, it's like, no, everything I had to say about my life and my story is in that book.
Yeah, and so that was one of many responses to interviewers saying, hey, so how did your dad think about this book? Or what are you planning to do for the holidays this year with your family? That kind of a thing. And she just very firmly is like, I don't talk about that. Here's another example. She says, my relationship with my family is between me and my family. How everyone in the world reacted to my book is between me and them. I have a professional self, you know. It's a version of myself that I'm willing to share and speak on, but outside of that, I need privacy. Memoir tears down barriers and walls in your world, which is a positive and a negative, and I'm still in the process of understanding that.
Yeah, it sounds like she was learning what would happen in a memoir by being pushed into a more memoir-like composition after she got her thesis out of school.
Mm-hmm.
You've heard a lot of stories about people taking their dissertation and making it into a book, right?
I have, yeah.
Yeah. I think this is a little bit like that. Obviously, it's not a PhD dissertation, but a work that had a different purpose than is sellable.
Yeah.
That's what school's made for.
Now, this last quote from her, and this is our last quote from her talking about making the book, I think also helps explain a little bit of the intention behind it. She says, I don't think that this will be my most personal work. I expect that there's going to be fiction that I do in the future, and that's going to be deeply personal to me in a different sort of way. And I imagine everything that I do has some of me in it, but I don't expect spinning to be the creme de la creme of the most personal thing I've ever done. I think spinning will always be distinct among a body of work, but I think there's a lot of myself to give in stories, just in different ways. And this was something I was thinking about while I was reading it, while I was asking the questions like, okay, like, what are we learning from these moments, Tillie Walden? And then we never really quite got there. And I thought maybe fiction would be a better way to kind of grapple with this stuff, right? Like the dysfunctional family stuff, which I felt like didn't really get due time within the book, or we just heard her mention that she had this like horrible illness when she was in high school that didn't get covered in here at all. Those seem like things that are so personal and so close to the bone for her that she can't write about them in nonfiction. She can't grapple with them. And so a lot of this book was her sort of pushing up the limits, against the limits, the boundaries of what she was able to do. And that fiction, from this quote, she just said, like, fiction might be an avenue where she can be more personal, where she can explore those things a little bit more.
Can you imagine what your response would be to spinning if you thought it was purely fiction?
Oh, wow. I don't know that it would be totally different. Because even though fiction and nonfiction are different genres, they still operate under the same rules of narrative and storytelling. And so there's still, I may have actually been more critical of it if I thought it were fiction.
Okay. Let's talk about the publisher just a little more. We like to talk about publishers and sort of do a quick diagram of them. And let's talk about first, second books. As we were learning about first, second books, I got really excited right up until I realized that they were yet again owned by a big five. So First Second Books is an American graphic novel publisher. They're an imprint of Roaring Brook Press, which is very hard to say, who are in turn part of Holtz-Brinnick Publishers. I never heard of any of those, right? They started in 2006 and are distributed by Macmillan. Mm-hmm. And then I find out that Holtz-Brinnick is a company that owns publishers around the world. They're one of the big five. Mm-hmm. How did I never hear that name before? I've always been caught by the other ones.
It's the
Hachette and
if they just said Macmillan, you would have gone, oh, but it's the umbrella company over Macmillan. Yeah.
Yeah, they hold the majority interest in Macmillan. First Second has published graphic novels by all kinds of folks. Eddie Campbell, Jean Luen Yang, Jessica Abel, Richard Sala, Faith Erin Hicks, M.K. Reed, Joe Infernari, Nate Powell, Lucy Knisley, Cecil Castellucci, Matt Kint, Mariko and Jillian Tamaki, Jen Wong, Jason Shiga, Paul Pope, Emily Carroll, and the McElroy brothers. Now, I just read that list like I know who all those people are, but I only know Eddie Campbell and Jessica Abel.
Okay.
Everyone else there is unfamiliar to me.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you that the way that I pulled that for this episode was I looked at their bibliography and I pulled all the people that I was familiar with.
Yeah.
And this was only maybe 50% of their output. So it really goes to show you that there is and we're about to get into this deep, there is a really deep disconnect between what is thought of as mainstream comics, but I think what we should really be calling direct market comics, versus bookstore targeted graphic novels. And that is First Second's work. They are not trying to sell to people who go to their local comic book store. They're trying to sell in bookstores or on Amazon.
When I suggested spinning, I had no idea that I was stepping into the lion's den of the book market versus direct market comic seller.
Well, I really think that's the big takeaway here, right? Is that there is a huge gap in what people think of as just a medium. The way that it is bought and sold and marketed is extremely different. The people that were all just listed there, those are all people that I've read work by. And some of them do nonfiction work. For instance, you said you know Jessica Abel. You know Jessica Abel because she did a book about podcasting. Mm-hmm. The other folks there, some of them do fiction work. Some of them do work that is more popular in the direct market, like Matt Kent or Paul Pope. Jason Shiga, I started off reading Jason Shiga in little zines that I would buy at comic book stores for like $5 a pop that he would Xerox at like a Kinko's or something. And then those became popular enough that First Second went to him and said, hey, can we put those out in a big hardcover book? So, like, these are folks that are they're closer to the, like, what is referred to as small press or alternative comics community. But the way that these books are being sold and marketed is not at all small press. This is the biggest publisher, one of the 5 biggest publishers in the world, trying to make money off of these things.
First Second's editorial director is also an illustrator and an author, Mark Siegel. So we should say that First Second is guided by principles of creators.
Oh, I think so, for sure.
You know, the larger publisher.
Yeah, no, I mean, I from my perspective, First Second is a publisher of books that have comics in them that aren't really targeted to you wouldn't see a First Second booth at New York Comic Con. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you would, but like their target audience is more ALA than it is, other comics folk.
Now, their distributor in the UK, is that through First Second Books, or is that Tillie Walden's publisher in the UK?
It's Tillie Walden's. So this publisher is called Self-Made Hero. The book is published through a different distribution platform. Self-Made Hero is a graphic novel company that is an imprint of Metro Media Limited. And Self-Made Hero also launched in 2007. So you're kind of seeing something here, right? Like these mid-2000s is around the point where people in the book world were like, wait a minute, there's money to be had in these graphic novels. And a lot of...
go find what published in 2004 that made everybody freak out.
A lot of the books that Self-Made Hero puts out, if you look at their bibliography, are retellings of things that are thought of as classic literature, and they're either done in Western comics form or as manga.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into all of the awards, and we'll really dig into this whole selling thing that Chris has been talking to me about for 4 years now. Chris, do you think there'll be a podcast school in Vermont sometime in the next 10, 15 years?
Yes, absolutely. I think that there will be more than one podcast school. There already are podcasting programs, but yeah, I do think that there will be specialty artisanal programs.
Yeah.
Yes.
And they'll have to start with 2 things. Like, first off, getting it up on the internet is nothing. Don't even worry about it. Mm-hmm. And there's only a few people who are going to make a decent living podcasting.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, right. It depends on who you let distribute your podcast for you.
That's right. And which radio station you were working for before you started your podcast.
And how much influence you let them have over your podcast's voice.
Look at you. You just got there to, we are a Patreon-supported podcast. Our listeners help us pay for hosting fees, the media that we research, and our recording setup, so that we can just do our own thing for the people who like it.
Yeah, and we're looking ahead to try to use that support to build the show further so we can do things like get transcripts made, create an internship, and possibly pay for travel expenses so that we can go to specific industry events and record episodes of Super Context there.
Yeah, we could set up in a hotel room and talk about our day on the floor.
A really good example of this would be like if you and I were able to go, for instance, to a small press show like SPX or Short Run or TCAF and talk to some people who are experts in the memoir alternative comics field and bring them on as guest voices for a show like this.
And if we could finally figure out how to get sales numbers on mid-list books.
Good luck.
If you would like to help us keep Super Context going, go to patreon.com/supercontext. You can sign up to support us on Patreon with a monthly donation. Now, we don't just want you to help us make Super Context. We also want to give you a little bit more Super Context if you support us. We have rewards like access to outtakes, some very filthy ones, bi-weekly bonus mini episodes that are complimentary to our regular episodes, and also a whole extra episode every month that we call Super King Context.
Yeah, that's right. Those are all about adaptations of Stephen King's work to other media. In November is when we're going to cover the film The Running Man, which I believe is that the first Bachman adaptation?
I think so.
Might be.
I don't know when Thinner was made.
Thinner, I curse you. The other thing that we do for all of our patrons is we thank them by name, unless they ask not to be thanked, here in the Patreon spot for the show. So let's start by thanking our newest patron, Luigi Oswego.
And thank you to our whole Patreon community, including Alex Laird, Ambrose Allen, Amit Doshi, Bennett Callahan, Beth Barnett, Billy Whitehouse, and Brian Chovanich.
Thank you to Carolyn Zoids, Chris Marlton, Cliff Landis, Coco, Dave Jordan, Dave Wachter, Eilish Phillips, Evan Mapstone, Fred Rasco, and Ira James Udiskin.
Thank you to Jason Puckett, Jess Staten, Jill Kaufman, Joseph Aleo, Junta/Cult, Calvin Ellis, Carmela Padovich, Kate Sharon, Kevin Wetter, and Christian Hirvala.
Thank you to Lee Fowler, Liliana Gill, Lokesh Dakar, Melinda Hale, Miriam Meany, Misha Moon, Nathan Weatherford, and Neil G. McGuire.
Thank you to Nick Sage, Patrick Malka, Pete Bowe, R.M. Rhodes, the podcast Rein It In, Matt and Rachel, Rob Sloan, Robert Negoesco, Roman Marichik, Ron Bilodeau, and Ross Llewellyn.
And finally, thank you to Ryan O'Neill, Sari Nichols, Simon Workman, Thomas Tremberger, and Whitney Buchanan.
If you would like to be on this list of thank yous and help Super Context keep going, go to patreon.com/supercontext. And we're back. So this is where we get into the kind of give and take of awards, and Tillie Walden being put in a place of, look how young she is. She's so good.
Yeah. And you started this off by saying all the awards that she's won. As far as I could tell, she only won one award for this book.
I should have said accolades.
Yeah.
Yes.
There were a lot of people that year who said this is one of the best graphic novels of the year. But this, again, goes to show you this weird division that exists within the comics community. So she won the 2018 Eisner Award for Best Reality-Based Work. And at the time, she was one of the youngest winners to ever win an Eisner at age 22. Now, the 2018 Eisners in particular were pointed out to be as a year where women were celebrated more than they usually are. They were recognized more in the medium. So there were a lot of other women that won Eisners that year, including Marjorie Liu, Roxane Gay, Emil Ferris, who we've covered her book on the show before, and Joy Murchison Kelly, who is one of the people who worked with William Marston and contributed to the creation of Wonder Woman. She got like a Lifetime Achievement acknowledgement.
And that was retroactive, right? It wasn't like the Eisners announced, it's women this year. It just, people looked at the awards and said, oh, it's the year of the woman.
Because a lot of attention has been paid in the last, I would say, decade to how diversity and representation play out in comics, both behind the scenes and in the stories themselves. And so, so it was a big deal that Tillie Walden won that award. I'm sure that the people at First, Second, and Macmillan would have liked her to have won other awards. The comics community, I don't think that the other award ceremonies that I'm familiar with would have acknowledged this book, because the alt comics people would have seen this as being too big for them to acknowledge because it was put out by a major publisher, and the mainstream direct market people would be like, what is this? That's not for us.
Well, I also got a sense from the way you were talking earlier in the episode that there's a lot of craft, like points of contention, or there's a lot of ways to critique it. That if someone was someone got it as a what do you call it, an advanced reader's copy, or got their review copy, they'd be like, well, this is fine, but what's going on with this? And there's not a lot of concentration on framing here, and
that's possible.
Some of this seems very loose.
That could also be more me. Like I'm very retentive when it comes to that.
I don't think you're special, Chris. You should know that. I think your response to this comic is not universal, obviously, but also it's not going to be, one lone crank, right? I'm sure that other creators looked at this and sort of didn't bring it into the more niche kind of award ceremonies. Yeah,
no, for sure. I mean, like the award ceremonies that I think of other than the Eisners, you've got the Ignatz Awards, which are at a small press convention. And so this book, Tillie Walden might do SPX, but I don't know that she would be acknowledged for her book there because this is put out by a huge publisher. And it's sort of the opposite of what that convention specializes in. And then like the Harveys, honestly, the Harveys, I call them the Golden Globes of comics, but they tend to lean more toward direct market favorability, but also stuff that gets like voted up because somebody's got a lot of friends who they get to submit to the ballot box.
Okay, I have a challenge for you. In 3 minutes, can you explain direct market, book market, and the difference?
Sure. So the direct market is when comics are shipped from a distributor, usually Diamond Comics, to a comic book store. And those are mainly thought of as floppies, singles, or periodicals. They also put out the trades, the big collected versions. A book like this can still go to a comic book store, and I don't know how First Second does it. I don't know if Diamond is their distributor or if they have a different distributor, but sometimes comic book stores have to order from a separate book distributor to get stuff like this.
Because Spinning was never a single issue series.
No. The book market is bookstores, both independent and, corporate. So you got your Barnes & Noble and you got your independent bookstores. Presumably there's a bunch of different distributors that those stores go to in order to order their books and have them appear on their shelves. It's a totally different market that they're selling to people with. The other big difference is that the direct market, as we've talked about before, those books are not returnable in most cases. And so the reporting that we see on sales figures are books that are sold to stores but not necessarily sold to human beings who then go and read them. And we don't really get as clear a picture how many copies of a book like Spinning is sold.
And sold through Amazon, is that book market?
Yeah, I consider that to be book market. And also to libraries. I think that's also part of book market, although those are sort of like Amazon and other digital retailers and libraries. They're sort of like Venn diagrams inside of the book market. There is also the digital market to take into account. So there are books that are read by people digitally, comic books on computers, phones, iPads. That is a completely different market as well. Although I will say Amazon owns Comixology, which is the like really big distributor for digital
that's
comics.
why I wanted to mention it. Yeah. So let's get into this. Oh, and well done. That was less than 3 minutes.
Was it?
Yep. All right. Rob Salkowitz in Forbes wrote this. For the first time that anyone can remember, superheroes are being... Okay, everybody, yes, we just talked about capes and cowls and all that bullshit. It's Forbes. They're not going to write an interesting article about comics. For the first time that anyone can remember, superheroes are being outsold in their native medium, American comic books and graphic novels, by other kinds of content, notably kid-oriented fare and Japanese or Japanese-inspired manga. Graphic novels are sold in the direct market and also to trade bookstores, with consumer sales tracked through the book industry standard system BookScan, now owned and managed by media metrics firm the NPD Group.
And now this next bit here, these are numbers.
Yeah.
This is, I believe, the 2018 numbers, because we haven't finished 2019 yet, and it takes like 3 or 4 months.
So get ready for some percentages. Together, about 90% of comics and graphic novels in North America are sold through bookstores or comic stores. That's direct market and book market.
Right.
With 9% going through digital services like Amazon's Kindle or the Amazon-owned Comixology, 1% sold on newsstands or through Kickstarter.
Mm-hmm. So when you think back to our youth and you think of comic books and newsstands at like the grocery store, nowadays,
spinning rack.
That only constitutes 1% of the total amount of comics that are sold. And so the digital thing you were just talking about, 9%, I've seen it like it's roughly guesstimated as 10%. And it hasn't really dropped or grown in the last couple of years. So it seems like that's like how digital comics are going to peak.
Yeah. Okay, now more numbers. Marvel and DC together, which could also be Disney and AT&T, account for 80% of all comics sold through the direct market. Now, the trade book channel has become, and I'm quoting again, an increasingly significant driver of revenue, gaining double-digit year-over-year increases as comic store sales have declined. There's an estimated sales of $465 million in bookstores. $1 million, in bookstores in 2018. And that is catching up with the $510 million that's in the direct market.
Yeah, so if you look at this at a graph, and this article had these graphs in them from ICV2, they're getting neck and neck. The bookstore market is growing every year, and the direct market is either stagnating or staying level.
Yeah, the direct market is mostly the battle between Marvel and DC for primacy. And the superheroes are being outsold generally by kid stuff, which actually is probably still Disney in a lot of ways.
No,
and
you'd be surprised.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of those Disney kids book, they end up outsourcing to other companies. Disney will have like Boom or IDW do their kids graphic novels rather than have Marvel, an imprint they own, do it.
So my anecdotal sense that there's just a ton of Disney kid stuff is true, but it's produced outside of the Disney sort of corporation.
They farm it out.
Wow, okay. The point of this article was moving toward, there's been a fall in direct market sales, and there's been a shift in stuff that's not standard superhero comics that's going up 20% comic store sales, 39% in bookstores, manga being up at 41% in comic stores and 5% in bookstores, et cetera, et cetera. All of that gives us a background of where was spinning going to go.
Right. Yeah.
And spinning's going to the book market.
Yeah, it is not designed for the direct market. I bought my copy in a comic book store, though. But the comic book store I bought it from was like a store here in Portland that is known for carrying non-traditional superhero content. But I think if you just walked into your average like Marvel and DC store and you said, hey, do you have Spinning by Tillie Walden, the Eisner Award winner from 2018? They'd go, what's that?
Right.
And not only that, but, I mentioned earlier that Comixology is the service that most people read their digital comics through. I could be wrong here, but I'm looking at Comixology right now. I don't believe that you can purchase first, second books through them. So if there is a digital option to read a book like Spinning, it's probably through some other service, but you cannot read Spinning on Comixology.
Yeah, it's a straight ebook if you buy it electronically.
So you're skipping over that 10% of the comics market, and then you've got another 50 some odd percent or 40 some odd percent of the comics market that's the direct market that may get their hands on this but barely won't. What they're shooting for is that $465 million, almost $500 million in comic book sales that bookstores have, right? And I'll say this too, Marvel and DC are catching on, and they're like, wait a minute, maybe we need to get in on that bookstore action. And so now they're starting to shift, and they're putting out books. I'm looking here at just the books that came out in the last couple of weeks that are distributed through the library. Just last week, they put out a Black Canary book called Black Canary Ignite by Cara McGee, who's a person I'm familiar with. She used to live in Atlanta and did comics. That is clearly like young adult bookstore designed thing. That is not a direct market Black Canary comic.
And there you go, young adult bookstore. Mm-hmm. So if we look at this David Harper, who was a guest on the show.
David Harper has been a guest on our show, yeah.
If you look at an article he wrote for Multiversity, he is essentially saying bookstores are big business because parents are used to bookstores. They're used to going to bookstores to buy stuff for their kids. Mm-hmm. The kid publishing industry is enormous. It's run by companies that are not automatically part of the comic book world. And if a parent gets their kid into a bookstore and says, hey, grab what you like, then these things that are aimed at, well, I'll let David Harper say, girls are choosing to get these books at bookstores or mass market stores. Mm-hmm. Despite there being the increasing popularity of comic books, he singles out Raina Telgemeier, who did Smile and Sisters.
Let me throw out a quick factoid here that'll fucking blow your mind. Raina Telgemeier, I believe in 2018, her books alone were 2% of the entire industry's sales. That's how popular those books are. And
it says that her books are sold at Target, and they become part of the sort of like going to camp or going to school, buying expedition.
They're huge. They're huge. We just got them for my nieces for their birthday last year.
So bookstores are where you can send stuff that will be bought by young people as part of their book buying rituals, unlike comic book stores.
Right. And the businesses of book publishers like First Second or Scholastic or now HarperCollins, they already have the infrastructure in place. They know how to sell books in that market. And so now that they're saying, well, we're going to get into graphic novels, they know how to sell them better in a lot of ways than comics folk know how to sell them. We're not even getting into all the conflicts that exist between Marvel and DC and your average direct market store owner who's like, Jesus Christ, how many X-Men books am I supposed to put out on the shelf this week? We're not getting into any of that. But like, the big book publishers have an infrastructure in place. So when they say, you know what, this Tillie Walden kid, we're going to give her a shot. Give her a 400-page graphic novel. We're going to get it out there. And they know how to sell that book.
I'm sure this is part of why I am much more comfortable with trade editions, because I like bookstores. Yeah. That's where I, learned to shop for what I was going to read. And I'm always happy when I see a big shelf of, collected comic books in the bookstore. I I like to browse, I like to find something. I like to see if I can find something that you've said is good. I don't know the last time I was in a comic book store because, as Harper points out, why go to multiple stores when you can go to one? That is the sort of the modern condition now.
Yeah, and I think that's something that David is very kind here, but I'll be a little bit meaner. He's not acknowledging directly here is that a lot of people feel uncomfortable in comic book stores because most comic book stores are not designed for your average customer to just walk in. They're designed for the people who are reliable customers that come in every Wednesday to get their superhero fix. And man, I can't tell you how many places I've gone into before, comic stores, where it feels like I've walked into a porno shop. And I have had many conversations with friends who aren't regular comics readers or women who say they don't feel welcome in places like that. So that's another reason why they're going to go, well, shit, I'll just go to Barnes & Noble or I'll order on Amazon.
And then they'll encounter a big book like Spinning by Tillie Walden and get interested.
Yeah. So you've got all these, factors working towards making books like Spinning not just more accessible to readers, but also more celebrated by the book community. And so then you get into this weird thing, right, where it is being treated with the same critical scrutiny that is applied to the literary industry rather than the scrutiny that is applied to the comics industry.
And if I can translate that, the things about the book that are compelling in terms of selling books or what people think need to be talked about in books, that's more important than technical considerations or the stuff that would make the comics creator community feel like something's a powerful work.
It could be. It could also be like that memoir is just memoir sells better in the book market than it sells in a comics market, right? I think about what was that book that we did, that fiction book where I really didn't like it, and we spent a lot of time talking
Goon
about
Squad.
Yeah, by Jennifer Egan. That is an example of a book that is like clearly crafted for the literary book market. And I think now that book publishers are getting into comics, they're looking for sort of like the equivalent of that in comics form.
So you know what's funny to me, Chris? The fact that this is a coming out narrative of some kind has been kind of buried by all the other stuff we talked about.
Yeah. I think that's especially interesting, right? Because a story like this, which I think is important, despite my like quibbles with like how it was put together, I think it's an important story that should be out there. But it's like, it's only received well by a certain type of market. And that's unfortunate, right? Like it doesn't have a place on these shelves in many comic book stores where like maybe there are some kids that are reading those comics and they need to read a coming of age story.
Yeah. I mean, there's the stereotype, obviously, that someone who's really into comics is not interested in sexual politics or, or gender or sexual orientation. But that's also just a stereotype. I would not back that up. But that stereotype, you just said it, like walking into a porno store, right? That stereotype of the kind of sweaty and very adolescent male kind of space needs to be opened up. It needs to be revealed as something that is more diverse and is more welcoming.
Totally, yeah. Walden herself addresses this, and I think, again, given our own identities, I'd like to turn to her or other experts on this thing. Walden says, I don't think I could have drawn a graphic novel about two young lesbians if I wasn't out right now. I always avoided the whole queer thing in stories because I felt like I couldn't draw openly gay characters if I was still scared to be openly gay. Now a huge part of my voice is the fact that I'm gay and I like writing gay characters. It's so nice to draw girls kissing.
It's so nice to not have your deal be somehow excluded or odd.
Yeah, and so this is an instance of both representation and diversity in comics, right? Like, she is a gay woman who is writing stories that include gay female characters, and she's telling again, like, it's the storytelling making sense of the world. She's providing that different perspective that you're not going to get in a lot of other stories.
Yeah, and her coming out story is in Spinning.
Mm-hmm.
And she says in the book that she wrote before this, the end of Summer, there's a gay character, but she didn't like foreground that character.
Yeah.
So in between End of Summer and Spinning being published, she came out and she was able to render her coming out to her family into Spinning.
So I have a question for you. Like, the coming out story actually is one of those points where I felt like the themes weren't tied up. Like, there wasn't I don't know about closure, but it wasn't addressed. So she reports on the moments in which she came out, and she reports on the moments in which she first realized that she was gay and had a girlfriend and on their relationship. But there's a significant part in the story where, because of the parents of her girlfriend, they're basically cut off from each other, and they're unable to communicate or see each other at all. And I kept expecting throughout the book, there's going to be a point in this book where we find out when the next time is that she's able to see her first girlfriend or talk to that person. And it never comes. And so it felt incomplete to me. It felt like the memoir wasn't, that I was only getting half the story.
No, I get you. So from the beginning of this recording, when I kind of heard your points of disagreement with the content or the intent of the work.
Yeah.
I've been trying to figure out, like, well, I really liked it and I felt very comfortable with it and I didn't feel any of this missing. So what was it that I was getting? And I think I have it. So a big part of this book is this young girl who is training in a very rigorous athletic discipline and being sort of made up to look a particular way. There are rules for how you move, rules for how you look, rules for how you run your day. Right?
She's
you have to go to practice.
Artificially feminized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And not only artificially feminized, but her day is being artificially structured in that she's getting this sort of adult schedule instead of a kid's schedule.
Mm-hmm.
And because of her sexuality, that's also happening to her in terms of who she loves or who she's attracted to. Because she's being told, be like this, because the world tells you to be straight. Maybe less now, but the world tells you to be straight. And she wanted to be, so that it wasn't a problem. She wasn't sure. And the book is about ejecting from all of those sort of constraints.
Mm-hmm.
This sort of huge, almost terrifying freedom. Going from, I know what my life is going to be because everyone's showing me how I'm going to do it, to this wide open, lost, what am I going to make of it feeling?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's why all of these incomplete threads are actually appropriate to the content.
Okay.
Because we go from
Because
rigidity,
it's about being lost and that this person hasn't found their way yet.
Yeah, like her adolescence, instead of being a sort of sharpening of herself.
Yeah.
And like, oh, I found out how I was going to be the person I'm going to be. She got to the end of adolescence like, oh shit, now I'm going to figure out who I'm going to be.
Yeah, and I felt like that was the tragic part of the book in between the lines, is that she still hasn't figured out who she's going to be. Even though she's out, and even though she's putting out this prolific amount of work, she doesn't seem to have fully grappled with her own identity yet.
I'm also a 46-year-old man who's still wondering who he's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I am much more inclined to feel sympathy, empathy, and connection with a story about someone who says, oh, shit, all my plans
Yeah.
were ill-founded and now I'm figuring something else out. So I don't want to make a case and say this is why you should be okay with it, but I'm pretty sure that's why I was okay with it.
I think that you're summarizing it very well. That's a good distinction between our reading experiences. Going back to Walden in terms of thinking about her sexuality and how it's represented in this book, she specifically says the book is 14 plus. So that's another difference between the direct market and the book market. Right. Yeah. So it's got this specific what do you call it? Regulation of who can buy it. But she says, I plan to make the most of that and get it into the hands of every 14-year-old and older that I can. I think there is a lot of talk in the comics industry and every industry about representation. We were just talking about that earlier. I want queer kids to read this story, even if this story won't necessarily relate to every queer experience. Just the fact that there are other people like them that are walking this earth and telling that story, I think that's hugely significant. So it's really important to her that this book is like a, hey, I see you. I see you and I'm also here. I get it.
And we didn't plan this to go along with Janelle Monáe last week at all.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, no, we didn't. But we just covered that record.
That
yeah.
Near the end.
Yeah, no, they're similar in that way. Yeah.
Walden tells a story of a dad coming up to her at a book event, and both of them crying over the realization that, this book helped him and his daughter kind of work out his daughter's coming out. He thanked Tillie Walden for existing. She says that. He literally thanked me for existing, for being an openly gay woman and sharing that with the world and paving a way for his daughter.
And then she says, I feel like crying again, just thinking about this.
Yeah.
There's a lot of crying that went on in the making of this book and in the aftermath of this book.
Chris, there's a lot of crying in the world.
Yeah. No, but I think that that's like the other thing that I'm getting at, right? Is it's just, I finished this book and my heart goes out to Tillie Walden because I'm like, I think there's more crying to come. I don't think you're done with the crying yet, and I wish you were.
Oh, there's always more catharsis coming.
That's true. That's fair. There always should be too, but yeah, I don't know. My heart goes out to her. And speaking of hearts, this is a weird transition.
That's a shitty transition.
There's an article about spinning that puts the whole figure skating thing into perspective and possibly why, a book company like First Second would be interested in telling a story like this. Gavia Baker Whitelaw, I believe, is the name of the writer, and she writes for the Daily Dot. And she says it's odd to compare spinning with Yuri on Ice, which is a figure skating anime that became really big last year. But side note, Charlie, almost every interviewer asked Tillie Walden about Yuri on Ice.
Which I have never heard of.
Me either. And Baker Whitelaw says these things are too different in tone, but you combine that with the upcoming Tonya Harding biopic, which we just talked about earlier, the I, Tonya movie. Yuri on Ice is an unavoidable part of the figure skating zeitgeist. While each exists in a different genre and medium, there are overarching themes, and some of them are most intensely explored in spinning.
So Baker Whitelaw kind of gives me some backing for my thoughts about, rigid to open.
Yeah.
She writes, although all competitive sports are stressful by definition, skating is uniquely anxiety-inducing. Success is tied up in the impossible ideal of perfection, with skaters expected to perform flawless jumps and spins for a panel of expressionless judges. I would like to point out one thing. That's not true. It's not unique. That's gymnastics, especially floor gymnastics.
Okay.
Right down to the having to do smiley face and like dancing and showing off before you do your moves.
Yeah.
So I understand where this is coming from, but let's point out.
Yeah, there are other sports.
Girls' sports often have this particular tension.
Okay.
On top of the hard work and highly specialized skill involved, there's a constant pressure to fulfill expected gender roles. Now, this is where figure skating maybe then leaves gymnastics behind, because gymnastics has that one thing about, like, you don't have to dress up like a Barbie doll and do gymnastics.
Well, I mean, I don't know a ton about gymnastics. My sister did it, but there is a certain amount of, like, choosing the colors of your outfit and what makeup you're wearing and how your hair is done.
But I'm talking specifically about a skirt and your hair done up. Like what Walden was saying, you have to dress like you're playing tennis, even though it's an ice sport, very particular kind of costuming. Female skaters must be delicate and feminine with neat hair and makeup that Walden portrays as an awkward and painful necessity. And because it's the norm, none of them consider objecting to things like the rule against wearing underwear beneath your costume. This is a weird thing that I just started finding out about, because my kids do ballet, they do gymnastics. At a certain age, the line of the uniform needs to be unbroken. And so then you're not supposed to wear underwear under your tights or your leotard.
Okay.
Yeah. Chris, I want to tell you all listeners, Chris just got kind of a dog looking at a card trick kind of look on his face.
Yeah,
like,
I mean...
What is this?
Well, I obviously disagree with that, because it just seems plain silly. But I remember my experience with sports growing up was that I was in competitive swimming. And I had to wear those tiny little swimming suits. And I, like, for instance, I was also encouraged to shave my legs because it was supposed to make you swim faster. And I remember the women who I swam with as well, there was a certain amount of awkwardness about, like, how much they were supposed to reveal with their bathing suits.
Right. Y'all are walking around in your underwear. Baker Whitelaw continues, it's an uncomfortable situation for any teen girl, heightened for Walden because she already feels like an outsider, without being able to tell everyone why she feels like an outsider, right? As a coming out story, it's painful and therapeutic. To figure skaters, the depictions of the sport and its culture will doubtless ring true. And for childhood overachievers, it's a first-hand observation by someone who grew up and escaped through an unexpected avenue.
Let's unpack that a little bit. So what she's saying, it sounds like what she's saying is kind of in line with my read on it, which is that there was an overachievement expectation on Tillie Walden from her parents and from her coaches and her ice skating community. And she escaped that into both being a cartoonist and coming out of the closet. And those were the two things that I felt like the thread didn't quite make it there by the end of spinning.
Meaning you wanted to know about the life of the cartoonist or the life of the openly gay woman.
Or just how she got there, right? I don't need an entire book then that is about being an openly gay cartoonist, although I would look forward to reading such a book from Tillie Walden in the future. My point is that, like, it just doesn't quite get all the way there.
I hate to end like this, Chris, but I do want to point out that this is an episode where instead of you talking about your experience of something as being how you took it, you are reaching out and touching the creator and saying that she did it wrong, that she made bad choices, or that she was guided in the stuff that was good. It makes me feel a little bit, it makes me feel like I'm spinning a little bit myself. So I don't know if you feel, are you being harsh or are you being something else?
I'm not trying to be harsh. I do want to say that. And like, to be very clear, I like spinning and I like this book and I'm glad that she made it. And I think it has an important place in the world. But I don't think that it is worthy of the celebration that surrounds it. That it is somehow like a pinnacle of what you can do with either memoir or comic storytelling. And I think that we've seen lots of evidence, both in the book itself, but also in how she talks about the book and how it was made and how her publisher worked with her to craft the way that the book was made, that made it something that it wasn't originally intended to be.
So it's almost like it would have worked out better if you had just randomly encountered this and said, oh, what's that? And opened it up. Or like me, just gotten a very simple recommendation from another individual and never had the gatekeepers enter into it.
Yeah. And so, I think as part of our duty on Super Context, Charlie, it is examining the processes around the text, right? And how those both influenced it and influenced how it was received by the world. I'll tell you this. If I went to SPX and there was this 22-year-old who was at her table and she had this massive collection that she'd been working on all through college that was a story of her growing up and dealing with these specific incidents. We didn't even talk in this entire episode about the sexual assault incident that's in this book. If I saw that and it was completely done DIY and I bought it and I brought it home, I would have been really blown away by the effort put into it. But knowing all of the machinations that were going on around it, it deflates some of its authenticity for me. You've been listening to Super Context, a podcast autopsy of media.
How it's made and how it informs our everyday culture.
Our theme music is Human Factor by Mile Marker.
And right now you're listening to Drive Fast by 3 Chain Links.
Show notes and all our past episodes are available at supercontextpodcast.libsyn.com.
You can email the show at supercontextpodcast@gmail.com to tell us what you like, what you don't like, and to suggest topics for future shows.
And I'm available on Twitter as @Christian Sager.
And I'm there @Bennett Radio. 2 N's, 2 T's.